Kia ora and welcome to another Cahoots Workshop tool training video. As always, this is not intended to be standalone training. The expectation is that you've had training at Cahoots Workshop and this is a refresher, or you're watching this video in preparation for your training at the workshop. This is a table saw. A table saw is really versatile. It's used for all kinds of things. One of the most common things is rip cuts. This is cuts along the grain of the timber. If we've got a piece of timber like this and we want to cut a nice even and straight sort of 5mm or something off the side, table saw is the perfect tool. If we've got very long pieces of timber and we want to do the same thing, it's also the perfect tool. It can also make cross cuts across timber, across the grain of the timber in this direction. In many cases, you'd be better off using the miter saw. Certainly for something like this you would. But if you've got large pieces of timber that you need to cut across the grain like that, table saw can be a really useful tool with the miter gauge, which we'll show you later. This is the blade. This here is called a riving knife. We'll talk more about that in a minute. This is a fence. This is the table itself. The blade can be moved up and down, and it can be tilted to cut miters. As usual, it's hazardous to cut material that has foreign bodies in it, right? So if you've got nails or screws in this piece of timber, they're going to hit the blade. That's not going to be a fun time. So it's hazardous to cut materials like that. Some plastics can be cut, some plastics can't be cut. Check with the manufacturer, the material manufacturer's specifications for those. There are limitations on how large a piece of timber you can cut on a saw like this. The saw is a certain size, there's a maximum distance between the fence and the blade because of the table size, and so those are all limitations on the size of the timber that you can cut. It can be a real hazard to end up with large pieces of timber overhanging the table. Having said that, it's really common to do long rip cuts and long pieces of timber on a table saw. You just need support on the input and the outfeed in order to do that. Often that might be a friend on the outfeed guiding the long length of timber out, or it could be an outfeed table. There are quite a few hazards with a table saw. First of all, there's dust. We've got dust extraction connected to the back of this table saw. We need to make sure that we're running that when we're running the saw. We also need to be wearing eye protection, and depending on the timber and depending on how good the dust extraction is, probably a dust mask as well. The table saw is also very loud when it's operating, and so we're going to need to wear earmuffs as well. There's a risk of entanglement, as always, a big fast spinning blade, and so no loose clothing, hair secured, nothing that can dangle into the blade. Risk of tripping or falling around a table saw is perhaps more extreme than with some other tools. There's a blade, which is exposed here, which is spinning. If I fall into the blade, if I put a hand out to stop me, if I fall onto the blade, that's obviously going to result in serious injury. There's very real injury with a blade like this of amputation of fingers, and so keeping hands away from the spinning blade is really important. I'll demonstrate the use of push sticks, and there are other tools that will guide timber through without putting your hands near that blade. The hazard of that spinning blade is really quite obvious, right? What's not so obvious is that one of the main hazards with a table saw is kickback. If I'm feeding a piece of timber into the blade like this, and for some reason the timber binds on the blade, the timber's not cutting nicely, when it binds on the blade, the huge amount of energy that is in that blade will be transferred into the timber and it will come flying out backwards this way. If you're using the saw properly, it's unlikely, but it does happen, and the main mitigation strategy is not to stand in the path of that flying timber. All of the energy of the blade is in this direction, and small pieces of timber flying in this direction with that amount of energy can do serious damage to you. If you're standing off to the side and operating the table saw from here, then that issue simply isn't there. You do need to consider what is behind you, what is in the line of that kickback. And so you need to make sure that there aren't other people here and that there is a bit of a clear path behind the saw. This kind of binding and kickback is more likely on smaller pieces of timber. They're more likely to move or twist so that they bind on the blade, and they've got a lower mass, which means that the energy of the blade transfers into them and sends them out as projectiles at high speed. Larger pieces of timber are much more likely to bog down the blade and stop the blade or cause it to work very hard and generate a lot of friction. That's not good, but kickback is the thing we really want to worry about. So the setup of a miter saw, we want to check that it's stable. This one it's on its stand, it's standing on the flat floor here, it's not wobbling around. We want to make sure that the riving knife is in place. This is absolutely critical. It prevents wood from twisting, dramatically reduces the amount of kickback, and reduces kickback to this direction rather than a whole lot of other directions. It is a non-negotiable. It needs to be here. It can be adjusted in height if it needs to be lower for certain projects, but it has to be here, operating behind the blade. The fence is adjustable, parallel to the blade. It can slide in and out. There are measurements here, but on this table saw they're not super accurate, and so you can manually check the distance between the blade and the fence. If you're doing that, you want to make sure that the saw is unplugged, because the blade obviously is a hazard. The blade can be raised and lowered. Turning the handle down here will raise and lower the blade. Unlocking the mitre adjustment and then pressing the handle in and turning the wheel again will tilt the blade. It's not reasonable to assume the blade is always going to be left at 0 degrees perpendicular to the table, so that's something you can check with a square. I've set the blade back to what is roughly perpendicular, and now I'm checking with a speed square. That looks good to me, so we'll lock the mitre in place. And now we need to adjust the height of the blade so that it's appropriate for this piece of wood. You want the top of the blade coming a few millimeters through the piece of timber. Excessive exposure of the blade just increases the hazard, but it does need to clear the top of the timber by maybe 3 millimeters. Here, the blade clears the timber by a reasonable amount. We'll demonstrate a couple of cuts on this saw. The first thing we need to do is decide if we're doing a rip cut or a cross cut. If we want to trim this piece of timber, make it a little bit narrower, 5 millimeters say, we'll do a rip cut. If we want to cut this piece of timber across, we don't want to cut like this. We don't want to slide, doing what is essentially a rip cut, sliding along the fence in this direction. It's very likely for the piece of timber to twist, bind on the blade, kick back, cause damage. And so the rule of thumb is that for a rip cut, the piece of timber needs to be longer than it is wide. It will then sit firmly against the fence, and that is the guide into the blade. We'll cover cross cuts in a moment, but first we'll do this rip cut. It's very important when guiding timber through the table saw that your hands are not coming into the blade, and also that you're not leaning into the blade, pushing the timber, because if something moves, if there's kickback, then there's potential for my body weight to throw me forwards into the blade, into the tool. For pushing a small piece of timber like this through the blade, we must use push sticks. Push sticks have a little notch so they can grip the timber, and we can use one to guide the force into the fence and the other to push the timber forwards. It is important for this piece of timber to be riding against that fence. That keeps it parallel with the blade, and that means that we're going to get a straight cut if the timber is not sitting hard against the blade. There's a little bit of a gap here. We start to feed in, and then we push the timber into the fence. That is going to cause twisting. That's when we're going to bind the blade and kick that timber back. Hard against the fence is the rule. Pushing with push sticks when you're close to the blade. If I'm feeding a large piece of material through a cut like this, it's perfectly reasonable for me to be using my hands back here to guide the wood, and then transition to using push sticks when I get to the point that my hands are getting closer to the blade. Again, with a longer piece of timber, particularly a heavy piece of timber, it's important to have some outfeed support, whether that's a person, whether that's a table. So I'm going to adjust the fence, bring it over here, and then we're going to make this cut. Because this piece of timber is small, I'll be using push sticks for the entire process. One thing that's very important in what I just did is removing this piece of timber. When I come to do that, or in fact even this piece of timber, I need to wait until the blade has stopped spinning. It's common for your workpiece to be over here, but you have to cut another piece, and so there's some timber in the way there. If we were making another cut, we could bring another piece in here. We don't really need to worry about this piece of scrap. This will move out of the way. We'll push it through when we make that cut. But if you do need to remove that, you must turn off the saw first. So just to recap, always pressure against the fence as well as feeding. The pressure against the fence should be on the in-feed side. There's not really much point creating pressure against the fence here. All you're going to do is risk closing up that cut. The riving knife should prevent it, but you're putting pressure on the cut and potentially pinching the blade. So this pressure into the fence needs to be on the in-feed side of the blade. And then gentle pressure through the blade to let the blade do the work. For cross cuts, we need to use the miter gauge. And the miter gauge slips into these slots on the table, and it allows us to guide timber safely through the blade in a cross-cut configuration. On the table saw, we never cut timber free. We never hold it and push it through the blade. There is far too much risk of this timber twisting. We can't hold it steady, and that's what the miter gauge does. The miter gauge allows us to hold a piece of timber away from the blade securely and slide it through without the angle changing. Now, as I said before, for a small piece of timber like this, you're better off using the miter saw. The results will be more precise, and the miter saw is just a safer tool. The miter gauge is very adjustable. You can change the miter angle. After changing the angle, you need to lock the miter in place. You can adjust the length. There's an end stop here for creating repeatable cuts. But for the purposes of this demonstration, we're just going to do a simple cross cut. Now your hands are going to grab the miter gauge and the piece of wood. They're going to be secure here, so they're a long way from the blade. And then you're going to slide the miter gauge and the timber together through the blade. One thing that's important is that the timber that you're cutting as a cross cut should not be in contact with the fence. That creates a chance of the timber twisting, binding in the gap between the fence and the blade, and then kickback. Again, in case of kickback, we're going to stand to the side, not directly in the path of the blade. We can't stand as far to the side as we did for the rip cut because we have to slide the miter gauge, but we still stand not in line with the blade. So now I'm going to trim the end of this piece of timber. I've moved the fence away from the blade, so we have plenty of room there. I can turn the vacuum on and make that cut. And so that's the table saw. Rip cuts, cross cuts. This is one of the more dangerous tools that we have available. The blade is exposed. There's a lot of energy in it. But if you're not leaning over the blade, if you're not putting your fingers near the blade, if you're not working in a way that you might slip into the blade, and you're being cautious of kickback, then you can use this tool to get really repeatable cuts and make all kinds of things. So get on down to the workshop and make some things.